Okay, without further ado, let me introduce today's speaker, Min Park. So Dr. Min Park is currently assistant professor in mechanical engineering at Baylor University. He graduated in 2012 with a bachelor degree in engineering science from Penn State. Afterwards, he got his master degree in sustainability from Villanova University, and then get a PhD in mechanical engineering from Drexel University. He's an expert in interfacial fluid mechanics, and he did a postdoc in Princeton from 2018 to 2019, which is when we met each other. And he has done a lot of very interesting research, very fundamental and also applied at the same time. And more importantly, his first 3 PhD students all went to Midwest, and the 2 of them are postdocs at the U, and one of them is in my group. So it's just a pleasure to invite you back. So now the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's a huge honor to be here right now, especially with even several people that I know. This is really awesome. I feel at home in more of an environmental-focused group, and so even though I'm in mechanical, don't tell my dean that, but it's I jokingly say that because we're trying to build one eventually, a department that's more focused on environmental engineering. But so yeah, today I hope to talk to you about some of the work that I've done in the past and on droplets and films. And I want to try to keep the talk light in the sense that I'm going to try not to talk about equations much, but talk much more about some future work that I think could be exciting. And so the main idea I want to focus on today is this idea that droplets and films are ubiquitous in nature and in industry, and they're quite ephemeral, so they come and go very fast. But and oftentimes the constituent parts that make up droplets and films can be very complex. It could be complex fluids, it could have particulates, it could have polymers. And my main research question to you today is basically, even though droplets and films, they come and go very fast, can we learn something about the physics by the way in which they come and go, so to speak? Okay, so I'm a type of person that when I see rain over in a puddle versus the oceans, I'm always looking at the drops, right? And just I'm always so fascinated by what's going on. And before I go anywhere, I need to acknowledge all the people that have made this work possible. The first 2 are actually here, which is amazing, and the funding agencies that supported the work so far. So my main motivation this morning is trying to understand better how we might manage this massive amount of waste with pesticides. So this is just from one paper, but there's many papers, and some would say that after a rain event or after a watering event, more than I think 99% of the pesticides don't actually end up doing what they're supposed to do. And so they end up in runoff, for example. And so there are many people working on this problem. I am certainly not the only one. But it's a huge engineering problem that we're trying to understand from an interfacial fluids angle. So lots of, and perhaps this is, I'm preaching to the choir here. People already know pesticides are bad, perhaps, for human health, for the environment, when it ends up as runoff, right? And so when it does not hit the intended targets. And so, and what's really, I think, doubly condemning for pesticides is that they not only pollute our waters, but they also pollute our air, and I guess you could also say the soils as well. And lots of the runoff is occurring because of the fact that even the pesticides are deposited on the plants after watering or rain, they get washed away. And so how do you make these formulations more rain fast, for example? Or how do you increase the rain fastness of these formulations? And so And all of these kinds of questions involve droplets, thin films, and particle or colloid deposition. And so this is kind of my main motivation, so to speak, is trying to address runoff of agrochemicals. That's how I'm framing it. Although droplets, films, and particles are relevant for a host of industrial applications. With respect to pesticide runoff, vulnerability, you can see that it's, sorry, it's a little bit pixelated, but you can see that the Midwest down to Texas and in the South are the most vulnerable. And so this is very much so a problem where I come from Waco, Texas, as much as it is here as well. And so this is a real problem that needs to be addressed. And the business as usual case, of course, is that pesticides are being distributed, say, by aerial means from off of a plane. But you can clearly see that there's a lot of drift. And so that's what contributes to air pollution. And there's also, even with modernized deposition means, let's say through UAVs, there's still lots of things that we still don't know as engineers. And then the last image is showing the typical old school way of just spraying by hand. But if we were to zoom into a single plant, how do we understand sort of the plant level dynamics? And then I want to go zoom in even further and say, how can I understand the single droplet interaction with, say, a leaf? And one of the reasons why we want to do this is because we know that there is a select size range of droplets that actually end up on the plants. For example, if the droplets are less than about 100 microns, they all fly away due to drift. But in drift, but the droplets that are of the order of hundreds of microns and millimeters, which are slightly less in the distribution, they will either stick or bounce depending on whether or not the leaf is, say, hydrophilic or hydrophobic, depending on the contact angle that the drop makes with the surface. But it's way more complicated than this, and that's something that I'm going to try to explain here in a minute. And when a drop impacts a surface, it forms a film, but it can also rebound, it can deposit, it can splash. There's many different morphologies that it can you can encounter. And if it does form a film eventually from the spray, then there will be thin film drainage dynamics that occur, which is also very complicated. And finally, whatever the constituent parts are in an agrochemical, or doesn't have to necessarily be agrochemical, it could be spray painting or coating in general in terms of applications. And then we have a deposit that hopefully is rain fast and doesn't get washed away. So what's in a agrochemical droplet? There are many ingredients. Say that there are active ingredients like organophosphates, but there are many, many inactives that often can do more damage than good. Mainly, say, polymer adjuvants is the main thing that I'm going to focus on right now. But there are also surfactants, buffers, oils, all sorts of things, even dyes, indicator dyes, that gets added to agrochemical formulations. And I want to focus on how the different types of polymeric adjuvants can affect how, say, droplets will interact with the surface. Why do we want to do that? We want to do that because I guess at least for the last 25, if not 30 years, there have been publications on how polymers can help droplets to stick, but it can also clog nozzles. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword there. And so it's not an easy problem to resolve at all. And when we add polymers, in case you're not super familiar with polymer physics, it can get the polymer drop impact dynamics can get very complicated depending on how concentrated the polymer is. So whether we're in the dilute regime where the polymer molecules are not interacting with each other in solution, to semi-dilute, to unentangled, to entangled, and it eventually becomes very entangled. And this is a kind of an elementary picture, but there are cases where it's even more complex than this. But generally speaking, for cost reasons, we're going to stick to the dilute regime because that's usually what the USDA is dealing with. And also, you only need really a dilute amount of polymers to be able to benefit, which is really nice. And in case you're not super familiar with rheology, just my notation for shear stress is tau, and for Newtonian drops, we know that the shear stress is proportional to the proportionality constant between the shear stress and the shear rate is just the viscosity, but of course non-Newtonian fluids are going to have a shear rate dependence for the viscosity, among other things. And so there are many, many, many variables that could affect non-Newtonian drop impact behavior. So when I look at the non-Newtonian taxonomy, there are generalized Newtonian fluids, there are viscoplastic fluids, which have many different categories for themselves in itself, viscoelasticity and thixotropy, which I think all of these things could potentially be relevant for studying that I'll show you later, that I'm working with an environmental science professor at Baylor. How would microplastics, for example, in the environment affect sediment rheology? How sediments flow or get, how does that affect, how does it affect the flora and fauna when these man-made things enter the environment? So those are some of the questions that I have I think are relevant for more environmental engineering applications. Rheology is everywhere. It's what makes the gluten-free products hopefully better over the years. But in terms of its mouthfeel, but mouthfeel is a rheological kind of term. So rheology is important in food, health, material science. It's relevant for many, 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 many applications. And so some of the work that we're doing, I'm framing it in an agricultural context, but it could be really beneficial for a lot of futuristic applications as well. And so something I'm not going to talk about in this talk something that we're doing in the lab is, for example, printing clay. Printing water filters with clay. So, which is really, it's been a fun new project. That's another thing that we've been doing. But I want to camp out on this idea of droplets for a little bit longer. And I'm going to quote Isaac Newton here. What we know is a droplet, and what we don't know is an ocean. But I think some of you in here may know something about that. And again, non-Newtonian drop impact is relevant for a lot of different applications, as I said, but I'm going to skip this for the sake of time, from agriculture to forensics. So where I got motivated is during my PhD, basically, in our lab, we did a series of experiments for drop impact on liquid-infused surfaces, which are basically omniphobic surfaces that are repellent to all types of fluids. And while we were doing these experiments, we found that, yes, of course, if you drop onto a dry surface, it's going to wet the surface. But then what we noticed was that when you start to, say, infuse a surface, this is an anodic aluminum oxide nanoporous template that we infused with silicone oil, we noticed that the drop would impact the surface and slide off. And so we thought, well, is this actually wetting the surface, or can we look underneath to see if it's actually even wetting the surface at all, right? But it sure looks like it's wetting the surface. So did the drop contacted the surface, and so we've basically done some high-speed imaging from the bottom and the side. The side, it still looks like it's making contact, but from the bottom, you'll see that the air gap underneath the drop will reach hundreds of nanometers. If not, it will go down to 100 nanometers thin, or about 1,000 times thinner than the diameter of your hair. Talk about getting close, but not enough, right? And so it generates an incredible amount of lubrication pressure underneath the drop, and actually helps to reverse momentum. And so the droplets actually never make contact. And so, which was fascinating for us, that this is actually happening. And anywhere that is white or lighter color means it's out of field of view. and anything where the grayscale intensity is changing, that's of the order of 100 nanometers. This is using principle of frustrated total internal reflection from optics. It's a little bit more complicated, but I'm not going to go into the details right now. We can combine this step, this technique with something called the interferometry, which is maybe more commonly known to measure thin films. And I mean, this is a very common phenomenon that you see on oil residues, say at a gas station after a rainfall, you see the colorful patterns. That all tells us something about film thickness. And so we can combine these two techniques, calibrate it with a known geometry, say a lens that you just buy from Thor Labs. And what we find is that and then when we look at drop impact, the air film looks something like a sombrero, but much thinner and compressed. And so one of the applications that we were thinking about is, can a single drop impact tell us something about its rheological and molecular fingerprint? And so this is something that Ziwen here in the audience worked on for a long time. And basically what we found was if you change, so on your left, it's glycerol water, so it's Newtonian. In the middle, it's xanthan gum, and so it's shear thinning, and it's non-Newtonian. The booger fluid is simply a mixture of polyethylene oxide and PEG, or polyethylene glycol, to make something that's not shear thinning, but all viscosity matched. And what we found is that only xanthan gum generates capillary waves, which means that should translate to something about its rheology and its molecular makeup. And so what we did was eventually those capillary waves will try to puncture the air film in the middle. And this is a very busy slide, I'm sorry, but basically these rings, the changes in the rings in the center tells us something about the changes in the droplet rheology. So in terms of application, you don't need a $80,000 rheometer. All you need is a drop and possibly a smartphone is what I'm working on right now for fun. Because you just need the final deformation and you don't necessarily need even high-speed imaging for that. And so we're trying to find a way to cheaply do this for maybe outreach purposes. But so these are quantified data of how that central dimple is, or the center line of the drop is changing in time. And I'm going to kind of fast forward through here as well because I want to get through a lot of content. Sorry. Cross section of the drop kind of looks like this. There's the top surface of the drop is coming down. It generates a squeeze film, but it's non-Newtonian. And so there are equations that we have to follow that's going to determine how much squeezing we get. So I want to just camp out here because this is really the main thing. The main thing here is that usually when you determine those critical overlap concentrations for polymer dynamics, rheologists usually look at, if I change the polymer concentration, how does my viscosity change? And there's usually a slope change once you go from a dilute regime where the polymer molecules are not interacting with each other, and then to an entangled regime where they are interacting with each other. And there's also a semi-dilute regime in between, but there's slope changes that you can infer that at the point of that slope change is where your critical concentration is. But you can see it's not easy to see that in this plot, and this is the rheometer-derived plot. And but above is the plot that we derive from drop impact, and they align pretty well. But we think that the drop impact derived critical concentrations like C star, C double star are probably more accurate. Okay, and so and easier and less prone to user error because a rheometer is prone to things like how the user has placed the sample on and loaded the sample, for example, how you prep the sample beforehand. There's lots of room for human error. There are also evaporative effects. With drop impact, we don't have any of those issues. Now, I said in the beginning that I'll try to focus more on some of the exciting future work that I think are possible, and I hope that it does one of three things. It might spur new ideas for your research, hopefully, or it brings collaborative work, perhaps, and at the least, hopefully, it's mildly entertaining. So one of the things that I'm really interested in right now is how does the droplet rheology, how can we measure different aspects of droplet rheology, basically? And so one of the things that we've done is I looked at something like lapinite, which is a clay that I think Dr. Yang introduced me to a long time ago. And so I asked the company to give us a sample, and we found that the drop impact air film dynamics is highly sensitive to the recovery time of the clay. So at first we mix it very, very, very fast, so it's liquid-like here. But then as we age the sample before impact, it becomes increasingly solid-like and elastic. And so this is something that is very preliminary. We're still working on this. And so this is rheology and thixotropy is something that's interesting to you. Thixotropy is a time dependence with respect to its, say, viscosity that is much more complicated than that. And I think there's thixotropy, I think, is still a hotly debated idea in the rheological community. But that's just my 5-second version of it. And again, I mentioned earlier that I'm very interested right now in how microplastics, microfibers that are entering the environment, how does it influence sediment rheology? And so we put microplastics into lapinite, bentonite, and different types of clays, and found that not only is the zero shear viscosity changing, but the recovery time, the thixotropic recovery time, is also changing. And so this is very preliminary, and the lines might not look that different to you, but it's about 20 to 40% sometimes difference. But it's very preliminary. But if for example, there was a lab where I can get real sediment and real microplastics that are more environmentally relevant, I think that would make a tremendous study. I think that could be very interesting. There's only maybe 2 or 3 studies that have ever looked at this, but one of them uses a particle to spindle gap ratio that is very large, which is a big no-no in rheology, and so it's not trustworthy data. But I think there's a lot of other things that could be done as well. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about drop deposition and jetting. And so the reason why this is so important is because in agrochemical application, we want the droplets to stick. But and people have shown that basically when you add a dilute amount of polymers, say about 100 parts per million or about 0.01% polyethylene oxide with 4 megadaltons, it's a very high molecular weight polymer, you can see that on a hydrophobic surface, the water drops will bounce, but then the polymer drops will stick. And so, this group wasn't the first necessarily to do this. Daniel Boger, for example, in Australia, I think, has published an earlier study as well. And many people were thinking about it for, I'm sure, decades before somebody ever actually published on it. But there's a really basic question that we have, and it seems like polymer additives help droplets to stick, but in our lab we found that it's not always the case, and we don't know why. But I want to show you sort of what the drop jetting dynamics look like when you add polymer additives. So when you only have about even when you have about 10 parts per million, if it was water, it just bounces. But you can see that it has a very peculiar bouncing dynamics. It's quite fun to watch, and you can see this beads on a string formation as this jet is called a Worthington jet, and it tells us already something about the polymer, the molecular makeup in this drop because of this thin filament formation. and pinch-off dynamics. If you add about 100 parts per million, you can see at a particular Weber number, which is comparing the relative importance of inertia to surface tension effects, you can see that it still jets, at least on this hydrophobic surface. But again, you see this beads on a string structure, and it jets, but then the droplet that jetted actually returns. It's almost like a Spider-Man, right? And so the question is, a lot of times in the literature, people will say it's very binary. If you jet, then it's secondary fragmentation, so it's bad. And if it doesn't jet, if it sticks, then great. But actually, you can have cases that are intermediate. You can have cases where the droplet jets, but then it actually comes back. And so and nobody really has a way of characterizing those formulations. And if you keep adding polymers in, it just straight bounces. At least when you have a very smooth surface like ours. And so this was very surprising for us because the conventional wisdom was that 100 parts per million is all you need, it'll stick. But it's not necessarily true. It's very, very sensitive to the impact dynamics, and the bounce and sticking dynamics are very sensitive to concentration, which is not as well understood in the literature. And you can imagine when somebody is spraying something that there will be evaporative effects where there will be a concentration, maybe even gradient, depending on what kind of shear flow these plumes are experiencing, right? So you can imagine that there should be evaporative effects too that hasn't really been captured in the literature yet. Okay, so the thing that I want to show here is that this is all preliminary, but SA is sodium alginate. This is polyacrylamide, guar gum, and tamarind. Polyacrylamide we used because that is currently being used on the field, and we're kind of testing that with biological polymers, which is everything else. What we found is that when we change the zeta potential of the polymers and the concentration of the polymers, we found that whether or not the droplets will stick or bounce completely changes. And so we thought, well, this is interesting because the conventional wisdom, again, says high molecular weight polymer, stick. And then what we found was that that's not true. What we found is that it's actually strongly dependent on the charge of the polymer molecules as well. Not only that, but the way the droplets retract, the retraction velocities on your right, guar gum, as you continuously increase the concentration, the retraction velocity continuously declines. But for sodium alginate, the retraction velocity is actually constant, and then beyond a critical concentration, it drops. The way we explain that, the way I'm explaining that currently, or we're trying to explain it currently, is that sodium alginate is so negatively charged, and the liquid paraffin surface is also negatively charged. So there is an electrostatic repulsion to sticking, more so for sodium alginate than guar gum or tamarind. And so for guar gum, there's more sticking because it's just more favorable for the polymers to diffuse to the surface and impart contact line resistance. But for sodium alginate, it acts like a Newtonian fluid, where because of this repulsion, this molecule just follows that velocity, right? That retraction velocity here is basically a Taylor-Kulik retraction velocity, which basically means that if you just balance inertia with surface tension effects, you get exactly this velocity. But then beyond a critical concentration, you basically start to have viscous effects dominate. And so the sodium alginate plot is purely a viscous and Newtonian physics there, whereas guar gum is non-Newtonian physics there. But we're still trying to understand whether or not our elementary model, which basically compares the rate of diffusion of the polymer molecules to the advection in the drop due to the inertial retraction, whether that's a good enough model. So far, we had to put no prefactor, and we can predict this retraction velocity, but it's still preliminary because we only have 4 data points. So I have many future work questions that I think are unresolved. For example, how do these drops interact with real leaves, with these biologically derived adjuvants, which are supposed to be more bee safe, or pollinator safe in general? How important is the diffusion of polymer molecules compared to advection? So that's what I just talked about. What is the role of extensional rheology? This is a hotly contested idea in, at least in my field, I think. I hope it's not something I'm inventing, but it's this idea where there's many papers that basically discount the role of extensional effects, meaning when you have enough of a strain rate inside the drop, polymer molecules can stretch and impart resistance due to the extension, kind of like when you're stretching a rubber band. But then some people will say that the extensional effects are not relevant at all during the retraction dynamics for various reasons. And so there's lots of room here. And the reason why I'm showing this plot here on the right is because there's also many different ways that extensional effects can be studied. So for example, you can just look at how a simple drop pinches off. And some molecules will have a very strong elasto capillary regime where there's a very strong elastic effect that's obvious from a slope change. So actually, this is even better. So there's an inertial capillary, and then you get elastic effects that makes this thing very obvious that elastic effects are there. But then for biologically derived polysaccharides like xanthan gum, we don't really see the same type of behavior, and we have to use different constitutive laws to model that. But it's not so obvious exactly how to model these flows for some of our biologically derived polymers, mainly because they can be quite complex for various reasons. But now, I think I still have a few more things to cover. So we covered drop bouncing, drop deposition, and jetting. I could also talk about splashing and talk to you about how some of the unresolved questions in the splashing literature. When we add polyethylene oxide and fluorescein as an indicator dye, we assumed that this interaction, so whether we have PEO and fluorescein or PEO, they look the same. But then when we were curious, hey, these vials sometimes are just sitting out in a very bright environment. Does that affect the physics at all? And what the student found was within 3 hours of being exposed to an LED, because what we have LED backlights that are very high powered, and we thought, it's LED, has no UV coming out of it. What's the big deal? And what she found was that the drop pinch-off physics was changing the longer she did the experiment that day. So imagine, I mean, you're a student and you're doing the experiments, and the experiment seems to be changing on you from when you came in at 8 a.m. versus 5 p.m. The results are constantly changing. And so we said, well, we should just probe this in general. And so she irradiated the samples over different times. And we found was that if it gets to about 3 hours and then at 12 hours, it splashes a little bit more catastrophically. But basically, the drops that were not splashing before starts to splash. And of course, there's some chemistry going on here. We think there's some reactive oxygen species that are being generated through the dye-polymer interactions. And the top right corner there is just showing the absolute irradiance of this LED output. We could apply different filters to knock out the blue or knock out the green to look at which wavelength this is really responding to, probably the blue. But we're not going to go there right now. And what we're just trying, I'm just going to focus on the middle plot for a second, and that is showing that the intrinsic viscosity and in the inset, the molecular weight of the polymer is decreasing as a function of the irradiation time following simple first order kinetics. And on the far right side here we thought it was pretty interesting that the more you irradiate, not only do you splash more drops, but the distribution gets narrower and the drop size, the average drop size also gets smaller, meaning you get more and more secondary atomization unintendedly, which is kind of a problem if shelf stability is an issue, which it is a huge issue in agrochemical in the agrochemical world. Just being exposed to an oxygen-rich environment could be potentially bad, or humidity, temperature. There are so many things that a farmer would have to balance to make sure that the formulation didn't go bad, right? And so it's quite a big problem that needs to be addressed. But in terms of the physics, because I'm really more of a, I was trained to think more about the physics than the application. And so something that is really interesting to me, that we're living in 2025, and people do not agree on what causes a single droplet to splash. At least I would argue that that is the case. Because if you look at the drop impact literature, you will see literally every fluid mechanics instability known to exist to be applied to splashing. Kelvin-Helmholtz, Rayleigh-Taylor, Rayleigh-Plateau, even Saffman-Taylor have been used to try to explain why droplets splash. And I think my favorite is this idea of basically when a lamella forms. So the lamella is this little lip here that forms as it as the drop spreads. In elementary fluids or undergraduate fluids, you would learn that this airflow above this curved region is going to have to accelerate. And so that's going to impart some sort of a lift force based on the Bernoulli theorem. And underneath the drop, though, people argue that there must be a very thin atomistic layer of gas underneath, which is exactly what we measure in our lab. And what we find is that that angle is extremely small, and the final splash angle is also very small. It's about 10 to 20 degrees when it's actually splashing. The problem is in the literature, in the most probably what I think is the most convincing argument, I don't find the Kelvin-Helmholtz instability to be convincing much for various reasons, mainly because we don't see the air film that they're talking about. But because they don't measure in this paper, they don't measure it, but we do in our lab. But what's really interesting is this group that talks about the Bernoulli idea claims that the splash angle should be 60 degrees. And everybody who cites this paper also uses this constant of 60 degrees, which was never measured. It's just a fitting constant. And so that's why I think nobody understands how drop splashing seems to work without some kind of fudge factor. So this is a very fun kind of mystery, I think, that is still ongoing. Okay, so some people might naively want to suggest that, well, if you don't want these things to splash, why don't you just make it more viscous, right? And there's multiple problems with that. If we try to increase the viscosity of the formulations, one, it gets harder to atomize. Although I have a colleague who's working in our department who can atomize things up to glycerol. And his name is Lulin Zhang, and she's phenomenal work on flow-bearing atomizers. So you can talk to her if you're interested in that. But it's very difficult for conventional nozzles to spray viscous solvents up to maybe 3 times the viscosity of water, and it becomes very difficult to atomize. Not only that, but our optics, which measures very thin films, we find a very peculiar instability. Even when the droplet looks like it's not splashing from a side view, okay, it looks like kind of like a turtle, right, coming out of its shell. And then you have on your right side is the bottom view, and the black regions are the wetting area, okay, and it is highly unstable. And so if we're talking about splashing being just contact line instability, then I would argue that even this is splashing to some extent. But and it pinches off actually many microbubbles that we can't see very well now, but you can actually see some from the side view, but it's hard to see. And we still don't really understand how this instability forms either. And so I think if we can address this instability, we might be able to address why drop splashing works as well. And I can tell you that if this grayscale area does give us something about the angle, and so and it's going to be much less than 1 degree, nowhere near 60. So clearly, when there is a spray, there's going to be thin films that are formed, and there's different sort of regimes that we could think about. If there's a long time after the spray has been deposited, then even that slow drainage is just going to follow the Jeffreys solution, which you can derive from a pretty elementary similarity analysis. But and then if you have a during the continuous feed, you can also determine what the thickness of that film is from just undergraduate fluids there as well. But there's lots of other research questions that arises, mainly if you have now drop impact on top of the film, what happens? Well, you can also have bouncing. You could have what Ziwen here on the audience labeled as contact bouncing. You can have partial rebound, something called early merging. It gets very, very ugly. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because in each of these cases, as the drops impact in films to thicker films and baths, it forms these micro bubbles that can actually burst. And so one of the kind of the future work that I think will be really interesting is if so there are studies already that show how when you have, say, in the oceans, sea sprays can throw microplastics and disperse it into the atmosphere. But what I haven't seen is how when these microbubbles are formed, they can coalesce, turn into bigger bubbles. They can also trap other things around itself, especially if it gets charged, say, from the atmosphere. It can stick to different surfaces. Say, what if there was a rainfall event near a harmful algal bloom? Can these bubbles bursting on the interface then redisperse algae? I don't know. These are the crazy questions I ask myself. So I asked the biology professor for some samples, and so we're kind of playing around with that right now. But this optical technique is basically tracking the bubbles that are generated above the liquid surface, or sorry, not the bubbles, the droplets actually. These are droplets that are formed from the bubbles bursting on the liquid air interface, and they're about 5 to 30 microns in diameter, which I'm pretty sure is larger, probably much larger than algae particles, right? I'm assuming it is. So, and microplastics and nanoplastics and such. And so I'm very interested in whether or not this is actually environmentally relevant. So lastly, I want to talk about evaporation and deposition. And so, because at least in the context of agriculture, the constituent parts are eventually going to dry up, and you get something called the coffee ring effect. And so if you can control this, you can get more even depositions that hopefully will allow for better coverage. And lots of people have looked at the influence of wettability of the liquid on the solid surface, but very few people have looked at, well, what about the wettability of the particles and the constituent parts of the droplet itself, right? So because this is a three-phase problem, not a two-phase problem. And so this is a really important question to ask. And whether or not that will influence the rain fastness, I don't think anybody's actually addressed. So that would be a good future study. But so I can just show you some work from our previous work where if you have a hydrophilic particle, okay, of water on glass, which is it's a hydrophilic interaction going on there, you get one big ring and a relatively even deposition. If your particles is more hydrophobic, then we get these really beautiful stick-slip motions. And we still don't really understand what sets the instability of the patterns and the pattern thickness and the separation gaps therein. And so we think that if somebody can tailor the physics, that could be potentially very useful for applications. And we haven't really looked at how these deposition patterns will influence rain fastness yet, but I think that would be a worthwhile future study. Meaning, we let a bunch of colloids evaporate on a surface, and then we try to wash it off, basically, and see what helps. And again, we can use interferometry to track the drop size. These are printed drops, so these are picoliter sized drops. The diameter is about the diameter of your hair. And so they're very, 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 very small. Both the non-wetting and more wetting particles don't change the change in volume at all. But what's really interesting to me, at least, I don't know, it might not be interesting to other people. I'm just going to focus on this part, is that the volume fraction over time is vastly different for when the particle is more wetting versus the particles that are less wetting. So meaning for the case where the particles are more wetting, the carboxylate modified nanoparticles, the volume fraction initially slightly increases and falls. But then for the less wetting particles, the volume fraction actually goes up, which was very surprising to us. But it kind of makes sense because the particles are being swept away from the contact line. But to us, this is one of the key aspects that I think will help us understand why biopolymers are also sticking or not sticking, because some of them are being swept away from the contact line, and we need a method that basically can track in situ the polymer concentration in time. That would be transformational. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up here and end with the same quote, but I'm going to modify it a little bit and say, I mean, I don't want to question Isaac Newton, but I'm going to say that after this presentation, hopefully you can see that not only do we not know not only do we not know the ocean, but what we don't know is a droplet as well. And certainly what we don't know is an ocean. So that basically summarizes my talk. I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions.
If I were a farmer and my plants were made out of glass, I would be impressed. You never talked about the interaction with the surface, the biological surface of, and frankly, I just don't know. Are leaves charged on some and not on others?
Yeah.
And does the charge change depending on when it's applied?
Yeah.
But all your experiments were done on manufactured surfaces.
Yeah, they were. Yeah, that's a great point. And so right now, all of our experiments are very controlled. And so the closest thing that we've done is using parafilm surfaces, or I guess it's made out of paraffin wax is what that is. And it's used in an ASTM standard for agricultural drop deposition, which is why we're using it. And so, and some of the experiments were on glass, but the parafilm surfaces are hydrophobic. And so, and plant leaves in agriculture, the wettability changes between 50 degrees to, this is the static constant angle, to 160, I believe. And so, yeah, you're right. We have to actually look at real plant surfaces. And what we quickly realized through our USDA contacts is the plant leaf properties also changes from when it's a juvenile to mature. It's really fascinating. And so we're working on which plant leaves to strategically test. We're working on it. But yeah, I think if there were some experts that could help us get a range of wettability, for example, we don't want to test the same type of leaf, but it's going to take time to categorize these things too that are going to be most impactful for say farmers. And so, yeah, you're right. We're working on it, but yeah, most of these were very controlled environments. Yeah, thanks for that question.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering if there was a significant variation in the shear rate as the droplet impacts the surface. And does this affect anything?
Yeah, the question is there any significant shear rate when the drop impacts surface? So that's a fantastic question. In that the shear rate, we can think of it as an average quantity based on, say, the impact velocity and the diameter. It can back out a global shear rate, but there's also localized shear rates that are in play too. And Dr. Cheng here in Chemical also is publishing a very nice paper on that idea. But the idea is, if I look at, oops, come back. So okay. So if I look at something like this, it's kind of hard to see, but the middle video is showing capillary waves, whereas the other ones, the capillary waves are more stunted, so to speak. And so the middle video is showing that there's a local shear rate that's huge. And so it's triggering shear thinning effects. And so It's really complicated. The answer is it's very complicated. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh,
Thank you, Jim. Yeah, very nice talk. Thank you. One thing that I've been working on many years ago was a particle wall collision, which is a very much more simple problem than this. But what we realize is that there is a wake of the particle that is traveling with the particle. And when the particle hit the wall, the wake form a toroidal structure, which is kind of a downwash that is acting on the on whatever droplet will start to spread. Right. So there is the fluid kind of particle interaction mechanism going on with this toroidal structure essentially sweep the wall.
yes.
So that there is, I think there's quite a bit of experiment on the fluid phase of what changes both in air and in water. You have all this vertical structure following and spreading. So that may provide some understanding beyond what you're doing on the particle and the droplet itself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, and I think there are experiments with PIV showing the vertical structures, at least if a drop was to impact a very dusty surface, they looked at how does that dust then travel. Or I've seen from, I think, City Nagel's group in Chicago, they also looked at sort of these toroidal structures that form. But it's I think you're right. We just assume that the ambient fluid is just kind of quiescent, but that's not true at all. So yeah. That's a good point.
Yeah. Thanks.
Any other questions?
Yeah, you spoke about the making the pesticides more rain fast. Can you talk about maybe potential implications on, well, now the pesticides, how can we get them off delivering them to the consumer or anything like that? Is that a worry that's in the back of your mind, or is the fact that we're losing such less to runoff mean that we can use such little amounts of pesticide? Is that kind of the balance there?
That's a great question, and that's outside of my wheelhouse, but it's a very good question. And my guess is that if we can make it more rain fast, we don't have to pump so much and I'm much more concerned about the runoff, the pollution to the environment, more than the human health outcomes right at the moment. But of course, I think right now, which one has a worse human health outcome? And that's a question that is worth having probably with some other people as well. But yeah, my guess is that if we can get it to stick better, we can use less. It's not going to change the net amount of pesticides that we're consuming, but it is definitely going to dramatically change how much pesticides are going into both the air and water, and also the soil. But so I don't know if that does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah,
So,
thank you.
but yeah, I don't like pesticides myself. I wish we can develop integrated pest management and organic farming, regenerative farming. I'm very pro all of those things. But I think there is a time and a place for these things as well. And so, but yeah, there's lots of unanswered questions still. So, but thank you for asking. I do have to say one more thing, and our contacts are also interested in how pesticides are infiltrating the plant walls as well. And so if we add these biologically derived adjuvants, which are high molecular weight, does that change that infiltration dynamics, which might actually make it safer then? Because then if the high molecular polymers are preventing the pesticide from infiltrating, then you can wash it off better. So there's many different ways this problem is being looked at. So, but I'm glad you asked.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pai, for the great talk. Currently, we are working on a project with Dr. Yang. We study evaporation-driven deposition of clay particles in porous microchannels. What we see is that when the air bubbles are expanding inside the porous microchannel, when the water is evaporating, the clays are going through, getting close to this interface, and at the same time, they're being pulled through these pillars that we have, these microchannels. So after the water is evaporated, they form these really beautiful clay bridges all over the channel. So I'm curious to see you did some experiments with hydrophilic and hydrophobic, and they're sticking on the glass slide. I'm curious what kind of polymers that you used. Is it clays or polymers? I forgot about that. I wanted to ask that.
So those were polymeric particles. They were polystyrene, if I remember correctly. But I think we did the same experiments with silica as well. So it could be polymer, could be, doesn't have to be. But I think the question that you're asking, it sounds like a lot of the literature on skin formation during evaporation, and I can send you some papers where they talk about that physics of evaporation-induced skin formation of solid particles on a liquid-air interface. So sounds like an interesting problem.
So do you think that this can be used as a filtration technique to, like, for example, we see that based on the how much the wetting the particle is, it sticks on different surfaces, including the PDMS and the glass slide. So do you think this can be used as a filtration system for the future?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure off the top of my head because usually when you're trying to filter something, it has a variety of charges. Nature doesn't care about how many constituent parts are in like a water treatment water, and so it's usually very complicated. And so it's not like a laboratory environment where you can choose and tailor what kind of charged species you have. So and trying to be selective about what you want to remove is what I'm also learning in filtration studies too. Because yeah, you can distill water, but you don't want to drink that stuff. You know, you still need electrolytes. So yeah, filtration is a hard water filtration is hard, way harder than I thought. Study. Really interesting. Humbling.
All right. Let's thank me again. Thank you all for coming.